Basic hand stitches. Introduction. At the end of the session, you will be able to explain the importance of basic hand stitches. List the standards to be met for hand stitches. Describe the factors affecting hand stitches. Hello and welcome to this session on basic hand stitches. In the olden days, garments were completely hand-sewn. But times have changed, and with advancement in technology, today garments are made by machining. Though machine-made, garments continue to have some type of hand stitching used primarily as finishing techniques. For example, the finishing of a neckline and sleeves of a machine-made frock, chudidar suit, blouse, etc. are hand-sewn. A simple hand stitch like hemming or running stitch is used to do minor works like sewing the border of a towel or a handkerchief. Fasteners like buttons and buttonholes of machine-made shirt, frock, chudidar suit, blouse, etc. are secured by hand stitching. A simple hand stitch is used for holding the material temporarily till the machine stitches are made. So you see, though garments are machine-made, there are situations where you will be required to use hand stitches. Thus, the hand stitches form the basis of stitching. Knowing and understanding the proper stitch to use is important to the item's appearance as well as its function and longevity. So it is very important to know how to do the basic hand stitches to finish making a garment. Before we learn how to actually do these hand stitches, let's first take a look at the standards to be met when hand stitching. Standards for hand stitches. A well-made hand stitch will be secured at the beginning and the ending with no loose threads. Will have a uniform length. Will be invisible on the outside of the garment. Will be neat on the inside. Will have knots or thread ends between the fabric layers or hidden within construction details. Will consist of an appropriate thread type for the stitch, fabric and task. Will be smooth and not create puckers on the right or wrong sides of the fabric. Now let's see the factors to be considered while hand stitching. Factors for hand stitching. There are only two things involved in hand stitching: a needle and a thread. First, let's talk about the needle. A fine needle is best for hand stitching. Use short needles for single stitches. This is because, as the name suggests, in single stitches you can make only one stitch with one insertion of needle into the fabric surface. So a small needle would suffice to make single stitches. See, in this single stitch called padding stitch, where only one stitch is made at a time, the smaller needle is sufficient. Use long needles for multiple stitches. This is because, as the name suggests, in multiple stitches you make more than one stitch by weaving the needle into the fabric surface. So a longer needle would be best to make multiple stitches in one go. See, in this multiple stitch called tacking stitch, the longer needle makes more than one stitch at a time. Again, depending on the fabric, the choice of needle may vary. For thinner fabrics like silk, chiffon, etc., use short and thin needle. While for thicker fabric like roughly woven silk, wool, etc., use thicker and bigger needles. The second material involved in hand stitching is the thread. Always hand sew with a comparatively short thread. Thread that is too long can become tangled easily and will tend to fray and break. Sewing experts recommend using thread no longer than 45 to 60 centimeters or 18 to 24 inches for permanent stitches like hemming. But for temporary stitching like tacking, the thread can be longer. For permanent stitches, though there is a standard length for the thread as mentioned above, be discreet while choosing the thread length. Example, if the hem of the bottom edge of a tunic top is say 70 centimeters, then make sure you take 10 centimeters more than that measurement. Use suitable variety and color of thread for hand stitches. When choosing a thread for sewing, to get the exact thread that would match the fabric, pull a strand of thread from the spool and try matching it with the fabric instead of matching the entire spool, because only then would you get the exact shade of color. When in a dilemma between two shades of the same color, Always choose the darker shade that matches the fabric for sewing because the lighter shade will stand out more. With that, we've come to the end of the session. Before we conclude, let's recall what we have learnt in this session. You have learnt that though garments are machine-made, there are instances where you have to hand sew. Hand stitches are required to finish even machine-made garments. There are certain standards that you should meet when you do hand stitching. There are certain factors like needle, thread and fabric that affect hand stitching. Use fine needle for hand stitches. Use short needles for single stitches. Use long needles for multiple stitches. Use thin needles for thinner fabric. Use thicker needles for thicker fabric. Always hand sew with a comparatively short thread. Take our next session to learn about the basics of hand stitches.